In Hinsdale County, Colorado Territory, in the June of 1879, Charlotte Reese stood on the depot platform at Lake City with a carpetbag in one hand and her son's small fingers in the other, and said the same 6 words she had said to 6 men before this one. "I come with the boy or not at all." The town sat at 9,000 feet in a bowl of the San Juans. The peaks still white-capped in June, the air thin and sharp with pine resin and wood smoke, and the platform smelled of coal cinder and wet timber from a rain that had passed through an hour before. Charlotte was 26, widowed 14 months, and she had answered an advertisement in a Denver paper. Rancher, 31, seeks capable wife, must be willing to work, with a letter that laid out, honestly and in full, that she had a son of 5 named Ely, and that the boy came with her, or the correspondence ended there. 5 men before this one had written back warmly, courted her by letter for weeks, sent the fare, and met her at a platform somewhere in the territory, and every one of them, on catching sight of the boy's hand in hers, had found some reason within the hour to reconsider. One had said plainly that a rancher building a herd could not feed another man's get. Another had simply not come to the second meeting at all. Charlotte had learned to read the change in a man's face the moment it happened, the way a person learns to read weather. The 6th had turned her away not 2 weeks earlier, in Silverton, with the particular cruelty of a man who waited until the boy could hear him say it. Now she stood on a platform in Lake City, having answered a 7th advertisement more out of exhaustion than hope, watching a big, quiet man in a canvas coat come up the platform toward her with his hat already off. He was Caleb Marsh, 34, and he had come down out of the high country that morning on a mule string, having spent 11 years above timberline running cattle on Summer Range, so remote that most of Hinsdale County still called him the Mountain Man, half in respect and half in the particular unease small towns reserve for men who prefer their own company. He had placed the advertisement in April on a dare from his own foreman, and had told himself the whole ride down that he expected nothing to come of it. He stopped a proper distance off and looked at her, and then at the boy, and did not say anything for a long moment, which was long enough that Charlotte's stomach went tight with the old, practiced dread. "Miss Marsh," she said, before he could speak the word she had come to expect. "This is my son, Eli. I wrote you plain in my letter. I'll say it again so there's no confusion between us. I come with the boy or not at all." Caleb Marsh crouched down, slow, so he was closer to the boy's own height than to hers, and held out one broad hand. "Eli," he said, "I got a dog up at the place needs a boy to run him. You any good at running?" The boy looked up at his mother, uncertain, and Charlotte, who had braced for 6 variations of rejection and had none prepared for this, found she could not speak for a moment at all. "He's fast," she managed. "Fastest boy in Silverton," they used to say. "Well, that's good, on account of my dog thinks he's fast too, and somebody ought to put him right about it." Caleb straightened up and looked at Charlotte directly for the first time. "Ma'am, you wrote me a plain letter and I read it plain. I ain't never once considered you'd come without him. Man doesn't get to pick and choose which parts of a family he wants. Now, I got a wagon down the road, and it's near 2 hours to the ranch, and if you're hungry, there's a woman at the hotel does a decent supper before we start." He picked up her carpetbag himself, without being asked, and turned toward the wagon, and it took Charlotte Reese a full 3 seconds to make her feet follow him, because in 14 months of widowhood and 6 failed courtships, she had entirely forgotten what it felt like for a door to open instead of close. The ranch lay 11 miles up a valley of the Lake Fork, timber standing dark green on the north facing slopes and open park grass on the south, with the peaks still holding snow in their high cirques even in June. The house was low and solid, built of hewn spruce log with a good stone chimney, a barn that had plainly had more care put into it than the house, a corral, and a garden gone entirely to weed, which told Charlotte within the first hour exactly how long Caleb Marsh had been alone up there. He carried her bag and Eli's small bundle in and set them down and did not go past the front room. "There's the bed in the back, and there's a bar on the door," he said. "I'm in the loft over the barn from tonight on. That's settled, and it's not a thing you've got to think on again, either one of you." He looked at Eli. "Dog's name is Ranger. He's out back, and he's a coward about thunder, and a fool about most everything else. And he'll be glad of the company." That first evening the narrator will remember plainly, because it set the whole shape of what followed. Caleb Marsh built up the fire, and fried salt pork and beans, and ate at the table with the two of them, without once making Eli feel he was being tolerated rather than welcomed. And when the boy grew shy and quiet partway through the meal, Caleb simply talked to the dog instead, in a low, easy voice, until Eli forgot to be careful and started laughing at what Ranger was and was not permitted to do at a supper table. Charlotte watched all of it and said very little, because she did not yet trust it, and trust, for her, had become a thing that required evidence over time rather than a single kind evening. The days that followed had a shape to them, and the narrator will not pretend they were eventful, because their quiet was the whole of their worth. Caleb built Eli a small set of steps up to the corral rail so the boy could watch the horses without being lifted, and did it without announcement, the way he did most things, so that Charlotte found it finished one morning and understood only by the fresh-cut smell of the wood that it had been made in the night after the two of them were asleep. He taught the boy to whistle up the dog properly. He carved, in the evenings, sitting by the fire with his knife and a scrap of aspen, a small wooden horse, rough at first and then finer as the weeks went on, and gave it to Eli on a Sunday without a word of explanation, the way he gave most things. Charlotte took the garden in hand and the kitchen, and found, within 2 weeks, that she had fallen into the rhythm of that house the way water finds the low ground, not from obligation, but because there was, for the first time in 14 months, a house worth the tending. She noticed things about Caleb Marsh. She noticed he never once raised his voice to the boy, even when Eli broke a good bowl chasing Ranger through the kitchen. She noticed he ate last, always, after the two of them were served, a habit she recognized, because it had been her own habit too, in the lean year after her husband died. She noticed that in 3 weeks he had not once asked her a single question about the husband she had buried and understood, the way she had understood little else about men in 14 months, that this was a kindness rather than an indifference. And Caleb noticed things too, and did not say them, in the way of a man unused to speaking what he felt. He noticed she startled at sudden movement near the boy, though never near herself. He noticed she would not sit down to a meal until Eli was settled and eating. He noticed, one evening in the 3rd week, watching her laugh at something the boy said, that he had stopped thinking of the ranch as a place he merely endured the winters in, and had started thinking of it, for the first time in 11 years, as a place he wanted to come home to. A storm came down off the peaks in the 2nd week of that month, sudden and hard the way high country storms come even in summer, and Eli had wandered farther up the near slope than he ought, chasing Ranger after a rabbit, when the first crack of thunder sent the boy running for the trees instead of home. Caleb and Charlotte found him within 20 minutes, soaked through and shaking, wedged under a deadfall with the dog pressed against him, and it was Caleb who reached him first and carried him the half-mile back down with the boy's face buried in his shoulder. Charlotte half running beside them both, with her heart going so hard she could feel it in her throat. Once Eli was dried and warm and asleep by the fire, worn out from fright more than cold, Charlotte and Caleb stood together on the porch in the last of the rain, close enough in the narrow shelter of the eave that neither of them could have said, afterward, which one of them had stopped moving first. "I thought," Charlotte said, and could not finish it. "I know it." Caleb's hand came up, slow, and rested against her jaw, his thumb tracing once along her cheekbone where a strand of wet hair had stuck. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The rain coming down steady beyond the eave, his face close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath in the cold mountain air. "He's safe, Charlotte. You're both safe." "I know it," she echoed, unsteady, and for a moment it seemed the whole evening might tip towards something neither of them had yet given themselves permission to want. Then, from inside, Eli stirred and murmured something in his sleep, and Charlotte stepped back into the doorway to check on him, and the moment folded itself away, unfinished, the way such moments do when a child's voice calls a house back to its ordinary shape. In the fourth week, Eli came running from the corral, with the wooden horse held tight in one fist. Breathless. "Miss Marsh made this one gallop," the boy said, "on account of he says a horse that don't gallop somewhere in its wood ain't worth carving." Caleb, coming up behind the boy, caught Charlotte's eye over his head, and something passed between them that neither of them had a ready word for yet. They went into Lake City together that Saturday, the three of them, for supplies and for Eli's benefit, since the boy had asked twice to see the town properly. And it was there, outside the mercantile, that the sixth man found them. His name was Otis Grew, and he was the one who had turned Charlotte away in Silverton not 2 weeks before Caleb's advertisement, and he had ridden down to Lake City on business of his own, and had not expected to encounter the woman he had rejected, standing at ease on a public street with a rancher's hand at the small of her back. Well, now, Grew stopped on the boardwalk, and there was enough of an audience gathering, the mercantile's proprietor, 2 women at the dry goods window, a handful of idle men outside the saloon, that his voice took on the particular carrying quality of a man performing for witnesses. "Mrs. Reese, I see you found a fool willing to take on another man's leavings after all." Eli went very still beside his mother, and Charlotte felt the old shame rise in her chest exactly as it always had, quick and hot and practiced. But before she could speak, Caleb had stepped forward, unhurried, and put himself between the boy and the man's voice, without appearing to do it on purpose at all. "Mr. Grew, is it?" Caleb's tone stayed perfectly level. "You said something to this woman in Silverton in front of her boy that I understand cut deep enough she still carries the mark of it. I'll ask you plain, in front of these same witnesses you seem to want, to apologize to the child for making him feel like a burden, or to ride on and never trouble either of them again. I owe a child nothing. Then you'll ride on." Caleb had not raised his voice at all, and somehow the whole street had gone quiet to hear it. "But you'll do it knowing every soul on this boardwalk just heard what kind of man turns away a widow for loving her son too plainly, and what kind stays." Grew rode on. The 2 women at the dry goods window were, within the week, telling the story all over the valley, and it did Charlotte's reputation considerably more good than harm, though that had never once been Caleb's aim in speaking up. "You didn't have to do that in front of the whole street," Charlotte said, once they were alone on the wagon seat heading home. "No," Caleb said. "I wanted to. Man says a thing like that to a boy who can hear it. Somebody ought to say different, loud enough the boy hears that too." Before the trouble came down that mountain road, and it did, from a direction neither of them was watching, there was a good June and a better July on the Marsh place, with a boy learning to whistle up a dog and a wooden horse getting finer by the week. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything, and if you find yourself moved by tales of love, that survived the worst the West could throw at them. The bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. The letter came in the last week of July, forwarded up from Silverton by a lawyer's clerk, and it was addressed to Charlotte Reese, widow of the late Thomas Reese, and it was signed by a man named Josiah Pruitt. Josiah Pruitt was Thomas Reese's father, a mining man who had made and lost 2 fortunes in the Comstock country before making a third, more durable one, in a silver claim above Silverton that his son had staked, and that Josiah had bought outright from his son's estate, for a sum Charlotte had never been permitted to know the true value of. Thomas had been estranged from his father for 9 years before his death, over a disagreement neither Charlotte nor, she suspected, Josiah himself could any longer state plainly. And Josiah Pruitt had not written one word to his grandson in the 5 years of the boy's life. He wrote now because the claim above Silverton, which he had believed a modest thing, had struck a vein in the spring that assayers valued conservatively at $200,000, and because Thomas Reese's original filing, and therefore the whole of the inheritance question surrounding it, ran through his son's only living heir. The letter offered Charlotte $400 a year, paid quarterly, and a house in Silverton, on the sole condition that the boy be sent to live under his grandfather's roof and be raised. The letter said plainly, as befits the heir to a substantial fortune, rather than as the son of a common ranch hand. Charlotte read it standing in the kitchen with her hands gone cold, and then read it again, and then walked out to the corral where Caleb was mending a hinge and put it into his hands without a word. He read it through twice, slow, the way he did most things that mattered. "He wants the boy," Caleb said, "and not you. He wants the boy and not me, and he's got $200,000 of reason to get his way, and I've got a dead husband's name and a rented life. I don't know what a woman does against that, Caleb." Her voice had gone thin. "I've been turned away 6 times for having a child at all. I never once imagined I'd have to fight to keep him for having too much money attached." Caleb Marsh folded the letter with the same careful attention he gave to mending a hinge. "You don't do anything against it alone," he said. "That's the whole of what I've got to offer you, Charlotte. I ain't a rich man, and I ain't a clever one with lawyers, but I am not going to stand here and let a man who never once wrote his own grandson a birthday letter walk in 5 years late and buy him off a woman who's done nothing but earn that boy every single day since he was born." Josiah Pruitt did not wait for a reply. He came himself in the 2nd week of August up the Lake Fork Road in a hired carriage with a Denver attorney beside him, and he did not trouble to get down from the seat when he arrived. "Mrs. Reese?" He was a lean, hard-eyed man of 60, with a voice pitched for boardrooms rather than mountain valleys. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I'll add to it. $600 a year, and I'll not contest whatever arrangement you've made with this rancher, provided the boy comes to Silverton before the snow closes the passes. He is not a package to be delivered before weather closes in. Mr. Pruitt, he is a child, and he is settled and he is happy, and I will not sell either of those things for $600 a year." "You misunderstand me, madam. I am not asking." Pruitt's attorney produced a paper from a leather case. "My son's estate and the mineral rights attached to it descend through his lawful heir. As the boy's paternal grandfather and a man of established means, I intend to petition the territorial court for guardianship, on the grounds that a child of considerable expectations is presently being raised in a laborer's cabin by a woman with no income of her own and a man who is not his father, in circumstances the court may reasonably find unsuitable to his prospects." Caleb came around the corner of the barn at that, having heard enough through the open door, and Josiah Pruitt looked at him with the particular contempt of a man who had never once had to work with his hands and had built a life despising those who did. And who might you be to this arrangement? Caleb Marsh. I own this ranch, and I intend to marry Mrs. Reese, Eli included, same as I've intended since the day she stepped off that platform in June. He did not raise his voice at all, which somehow made it carry further. You're welcome to petition whatever court you like, Mr. Pruitt. You'll find this valley full of people willing to tell that court exactly what kind of home that boy's had here, and exactly how many years it's been since you troubled to send him so much as a letter. Sentiment does not move a territorial judge, Mr. Marsh. Money does, and documentation does, and I have both in considerable supply. He rode off with that, and the dust of the carriage hung a long time in the still valley air, the way it does when there's no wind at all. Charlotte stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, and Eli, who had come out to see the carriage and had heard more of it than either adult realized, stood very still beside her with the wooden horse held tight in both hands. Is that man going to take me away from you? The boy said, in the flat, careful voice of a child, testing whether a fear is allowed to be spoken aloud. Charlotte knelt down in the dirt of her own yard and held her son's face in both hands. No, she said, with a certainty she did not yet fully possess, but intended, from that moment, to earn. No, Eli. Not while I've got breath in me. The guardianship hearing was set for the 3rd week of August at the Territorial Courthouse in Lake City, and Josiah Pruitt's attorney had done his work well. He had located the man who turned Charlotte away in Silverton, and secured his willingness to testify that she had, in his words, presented the child as an inconvenience to be negotiated around. And he had prepared a deposition from a Denver physician who had never once examined either mother or child, opening generally on the disadvantages of raising an air of expectation in reduced circumstances. Caleb spent the week before the hearing doing the one thing he knew how to do, which was working, methodically, at a problem until it gave. He rode to every ranch in the valley and brought back, in his own careful hand, 6 sworn statements from neighbors who had watched Charlotte Reese mother that boy since June with a patience and devotion none of them had ever had cause to doubt. He rode to Silverton himself and found the assay office records showing the claim's true value had been suppressed in every communication to Charlotte. Proof that Josiah Pruitt's concern for the boy's prospects had arrived precisely when the ore did, and not one day before. And on the night before the hearing, sitting on the porch step with 3 feet of board between them, same as always, Charlotte finally asked him the question she had been carrying since the letter came. Why? She said. You've known me 8 weeks, Caleb. You've got no more claim on that boy than the law says a stranger has. And you're about to stand up in a courtroom against a rich man's lawyer for a child that isn't yours by blood. I need to understand why, because I don't think I can walk into that hearing tomorrow without knowing. Caleb Marsh was quiet a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains. I had a sister, he said, younger than me by 6 years. Our father died when she was 4, and our mother took up with a man 2 years later who made it plain, inside a month, that he'd take the woman and not the girl. My mother chose him. His voice had gone rough in a way the valley had never heard from him. I was 15. I raised my sister myself, the best a boy of 15 knows how, which wasn't near good enough, and she died of a fever at 9 years old in a cabin I couldn't afford to heat proper. I have spent 19 years since wondering what might have been different if one grown person, just one, had said the words you said on that platform, and meant them the way you meant them. Charlotte did not say anything for a while. The creek ran on below the house, and somewhere in the dark a horse shifted and blew. So when I read your letter in April, Caleb went on, and you wrote plain, I come with the boy or not at all. I did not see a complication, Charlotte. I saw the sentence I've waited 19 years to hear somebody say and mean. That is the whole of why. It was never charity. It was the one thing in this world I already knew how to want. Charlotte Reese crossed the 3 feet of board herself, and the narrator sets that down plainly, for there was not a thing in the world compelling her to do it. What passed between them then was brief, quiet, and entirely her own choosing, and what broke open in her was not desire, but the plain, unbearable relief of being chosen by a man who had chosen her son first and asked for nothing in return. The hearing ran the better part of a day, and Josiah Pruitt's attorney argued with the smooth, confident cruelty of a man who had never once lost such an argument in a territorial court. But Judge Amos Whitfield had ranched in that valley himself for 11 years before taking the bench, and he read Caleb's 6 sworn statements with evident care, and he asked Josiah Pruitt, directly, from the bench, how many letters he had written his grandson in the 5 years since the boy's birth. Pruitt could not answer, because the answer was none, and the silence that followed told the courtroom everything the depositions had not. None, Your Honor, he finally admitted, and there was a shifting through the gallery. Neighbors from the valley who had ridden 2 hours to sit on hard benches for exactly this moment. Caleb testified plainly when his turn came, laying out the assay records without embellishment, letting the dates speak for themselves rather than arguing his own case, which the judge later remarked was the single most persuasive choice any witness had made all day. It was Charlotte who was asked, at the end, whether she had anything further to say, and she stood and did not look at Pruitt at all, but spoke to the judge directly. I have been turned away by 6 men for the crime of loving my son too plainly to leave him behind, she said. I answered Mr. Pruitt's letter the same way I answered every one of theirs. I come with the boy or not at all. That is not a negotiating position, Your Honor. It is the entire shape of my life. And I would ask this court to understand that a woman who has said those 6 words 7 times, and meant them every time, is not a woman who can be bought off with $600 a year, whatever Mr. Pruitt's attorney believes about sentiment and courts. Judge Whitfield denied the petition for guardianship, finding no evidence whatsoever of unsuitable circumstances and considerable evidence of a stable, loving home, and he further ordered, on his own initiative, that Josiah Pruitt's claim upon the mineral rights be reviewed by the Territorial Land Office, given the timing of his sudden paternal interest against the assay records Caleb had produced. Josiah Pruitt left Lake City that same afternoon and did not return. The Land Office review, concluded the following spring, found that Thomas Reese's original claim had passed cleanly to his lawful heir, and that Josiah Pruitt's purchase from the estate, made before the strike and at a price far below even the modest value then known, could not be disturbed as to the mining rights already sold, but that a trust was to be established for Eli's benefit from the ongoing royalties, administered by the territorial court and not by his grandfather, until the boy reached his majority. Caleb Marsh and Charlotte Reese were married in September at the small church in Lake City, with Eli standing between them in a new coat and the wooden horse in his coat pocket, where he insisted on keeping it for the whole of the ceremony. They raised him together through that valley's long winters and short, brilliant summers, and the trust from the Silverton claim paid, in time, for a proper schoolhouse and a doctor's visits and a great many things a ranch alone could never have managed, though Caleb never once let the money change the shape of the work they did together, and Charlotte never once let Eli forget that the wealth was his by right and not by anyone's charity. On the corral rail at the marsh place, worn smooth by small hands over the years, there still stands the little set of steps Caleb built the first week Charlotte and Eli arrived, and beside the front door, carved deep into the log by a boy grown tall enough by his 12th year to reach it himself, is a small, galloping horse, cut in the same rough, honest style his father had taught him, with a knife and a scrap of aspen by a fire that never once, in all the years after, went out on either one of them. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out in the high San Juans of Colorado, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Caleb Marsh and Charlotte Reese became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real. Though the whole of that valley remembered it anyway, every time a small wooden horse came up in the telling. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.